Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. I want to thank everyone who responded to my community tab post about quickfire history questions. I'm going to try and get through as many of those as I can here. There are, however, a few I will be saving as topics for future videos in their own right. So if you don't see your question being answered today, it's almost certainly because I don't think a rapid fire answer can do it justice. Now we've had that disclaimer, let's hop straight in to the Q&A. The first question I'm going to answer is the one that gave me the inspiration to make this video in the first place. What's the difference between a castle and a palace? In the simplest, plainest terms, a castle is designed and built with the intention that it can be fortified. It's a stronghold, a defensive structure, whereas a palace is designed and built with luxury, comfort, and in many cases, pleasure in mind. A palace is a building that's made in times of peace, they say, whereas castles are built for war. However, I do think that separating out castles and palaces as being distinct, discrete things, almost the diametric opposite of each other, misses a trick, because it causes us to forget the fact that within castles was the potential for extraordinary luxury. Not in all of them, certainly, but in many of them, particularly ones that became royal residences, there were certainly palaces within them. Now, what makes this more complicated is that you don't get a castle in a palace in the same way that you can get a palace in a castle. I often think about the French terms, because the French have the term chateau. It's one that I think we're probably all familiar with. These are buildings of luxury for the nobility and for the royalty of France. But the French also have the term chateau fort, which is quite literally a fortified chateau. We would call them castles if we saw them, though. I think the French have the right thing in mind. The capacity for the castle to be a space of comfort and luxury, I think, is better expressed in the term chateau fort. And so when we talk about castles, I think we should bear that in mind. They are different from palaces, but it doesn't mean that they are any less comfortable, although, of course, in some cases they would have been. The second question follows on from the first. I was asked if I could explain what a keep is. The keep is the centralmost part of a heavily fortified castle complex. It's the defensive tower. Usually it will be constructed on top of a raised mound, also known as a motte. You may have heard the phrase Motte and Bailey Castle. This raised mound or motte could be man-made. Equally, it could be something that was naturally occurring that was then repurposed for a defensive structure. In the Tower of London complex, the keep is the central white tower. Another name for a keep is a donjon, which is almost certainly the origin of the term dungeon. And this is fitting. After all, once it was built, the White Tower would prove to be a relatively comfortable, heavily fortified royal residence, military garrison, and political centre that, within months of being completed, was also used to hold at least one prisoner. In this case, Ranulph Flambard, the prisoner who would also soon escape. How did exile work? Exile was something that you could be both sentenced to and also potentially a choice that you might make. If we look at a sentence first, as an example, we can take Henry of Lancaster, who is also known as Henry Bolingbroke, and would later go on to become King Henry IV. Henry was sentenced to exile or banishment from England by the then king, King Richard II. This sentence was ostensibly passed because Henry had engaged in an altercation with the Duke of Norfolk, who was then Thomas Mowbray. During Henry's exile, he lived in France, principally in Paris. If we want to look at an example of chosen exile, this can be found in the so-called Marian exiles. These were Protestants who found themselves to be unable, unwilling, perhaps unsafe, to remain in an England that had been returned to the Roman Catholic faith and to allegiance to the Pope during the reign of Mary I. Whether motivated by devout faith, fear for their soul, or fear for their body, these marine exiles spread themselves throughout various continental cities that were known to be more welcoming and thus potentially safer for people of their faith. The Low Countries and Switzerland were particularly popular. There were lots of questions about the various ranks of the nobility, how it worked, who sits above whom, how they got there and why. And I do think that most of these questions will have been covered in the video that I put up last Friday on this channel, which I will now link in a card, either here, maybe here, and I will also be linking it in the description box too. What projects do I have coming up that I am excited about? I'm not sure how much detail I can go into, so for the avoidance of doing something wrong, I'm going to keep this vague until I have got the proper formal go-ahead to tell you about it, and then it will be across my social media. I'll let you know what I've been up to properly. But keeping it vague, I filmed as a contributor for 2 documentaries that are for TV. I think one is going to be released fairly soon, and I'm really looking forward to letting you know what channel it's on, what it's about, when it's going out, so that you can hopefully go and watch it. I also hopefully have another contributor spot in another documentary coming my way soon as well that I still need to film. I recently collaborated with a friend of mine for a YouTube video that's set to go up later this month that I think is going to be really cool. I'm looking forward to telling you all about that. I'm really enjoying my regular Wednesday evening slots over on Instagram Live for History After Dark with the wonderful Philippa and Catherine. For those of you who haven't watched History After Dark, I probably should just warn you in case you want to go and see it now. It's a very different kind of arrangement than the one that's happening here. On Reading the Past, we are PG-13. There's very little swearing. I try and be as unspicy as possible. Occasionally I do dip my toe in that water. History After Dark is the opposite of that. Philippa, Catherine and myself all have various different social media platforms on which we all try and keep it PG-13. History After Dark is the place we can let our freak flag fly, so to speak. I'm having a great time. I really enjoy working on a more long-term basis in a collaborative context. I love doing one-off collabs, but it's very nice for me to have a group of people to work with. We're planning a meeting pretty soon to talk about the future of History After Dark, and I think that there are going to be some exciting times ahead, so I am looking forward to seeing where that all goes. I've also been back for just over a year, just under a year, teaching in various heritage settings and working with school groups that come to those places, and I have absolutely been loving being back in that world. Also, in the not too distant future, I am very lucky to have been booked to do some live costumed historical interpretation, and I simply cannot wait to be back in historical costume. So that's, I think, what I have coming up that I'm excited about. Quite a bit, I think, to look forward to. Is there a difference between a kingdom and a principality? Yes. In the most simple terms, it's really about who's in charge of that particular landmass. When it's a kingdom, it's being ruled over by a king or queen. When it's a principality, it's being governed by a prince or princess. In the same way that an empire is governed by an emperor or an empress, a dukedom is governed by a duke or maybe a duchess. However, there tends to also be a hierarchy. So a principality, the person in charge of that principality will normally have to answer to, swear fealty to, offer a debt of service to the king or queen of the adjacent or adjoining kingdom. With that being said, sometimes a smaller kingdom may have the same sort of relationship with a larger kingdom. Namely, the smaller kingdom will be a client kingdom to the larger kingdom that is adjacent to them. Equally, when it comes to there being an emperor, frequently a kingdom, a principality, a dukedom may all have to answer and be clients to the emperor who has the empire. I hope that makes some sense. Why are people referred to by their title, i.e. Charles Brandon being referred to as Suffolk when he becomes Duke of Suffolk? How do other people get that same title later? Some of this is going to be covered in my video on titles from last week, but I do think there is some additional hopefully clarifying and helpful information that I can add into this right here. When we talk about the Tudor court, a frequent joke that comes up is that they aren't very inventive when it comes to first names. Think about how many Edwards, Thomases, Henrys, Georges that there are. There just are simply a lot. There are a whole bunch of Edward Seymours, a mess of Thomas Howards, and a brace of Boleyns. Let's take that last one. If we talk about my Lord Boleyn, well, who is that? Who are they referring to with my Lord Boleyn? However, if we talk about Wiltshire, my Lord of Wiltshire, we know that that is Thomas Boleyn. For much of the time when we talk about Viscount Rochford, we're going to connect that with George Boleyn. So we know that after a certain year, George Boleyn is Viscount Rochford. He's going to be known as my Lord Rochford, because there are two prominent male Boleyns and a whole bunch of other Boleyns that are also incredibly prominent. Similarly, making Thomas Boleyn Wiltshire, there are so many Thomases, being able to specify that we mean this one is a, in quotes, good thing. The same with the Howards. Knowing that one is the Duke of Norfolk, we recognise which Howard that's going to be. We know that he is the superior Howard of the clan. When it comes to these titles being passed on to somebody, the son of the Duke of Norfolk becomes the Duke of Norfolk. He inherits that title. However, another way for a title to be passed on is that it can revert to the crown. And it can revert to the crown in two ways. Either the bloodline dies out, there is nobody left to inherit it, they die without an heir, for example. At that point, that title returns to the crown. The other alternative is that that duke, that earl, that lord is convicted of being a traitor, executed and attainted for treason. All of their lands and titles become forfeit to the crown. So if a title is forfeit to the crown or reverts to the crown, then it's essentially null and void. However, the crown can then choose to create somebody else in that title. So you can get a second creation, for example, of the Dukes of Buckingham. I hope that helps. When did identification documents become common? Now, there's always going to be reason for people to move between communities. But for many centuries in the past, this would be a cause for suspicion. When we talk about how travelling bands of actors were viewed, for example, as potential vagrants, thieves, pickpockets, other forms of criminal, the reason is because they are travelling from place to place, never setting down roots, never fully meshing with a local community. And these villages and towns of this country used to be fairly closed spaces in many ways. People would know each other potentially from childhood. People would work alongside one another. People would know whom they could trust because they have grown up together. But of course, there are reasons for people to move communities, for work, because their master has sent them, because they have completed a training that makes them useful elsewhere, at which point they're going to be given probably a letter of introduction. This letter of introduction will carry various seals. It may be sealed by the lord of their local area, by the guild they are part of. Essentially, it's to tell people who they are, what skills they have managed to acquire, and why they might be useful and trustworthy to employ, to allow to live alongside you, whatever else. When it comes to travelling abroad, there certainly were passports, or in the earliest phase, they're called safe conduct documents. And these safe conduct documents date from at least the early 1400s. There is, as I said, a distrust of peripatetic lifestyles like that of the players. But in documents like these letters of introduction or these letters of safe conduct, there is a recognition that travel and movement for work or service is perhaps a necessary evil. What is a manor house? When England was a feudal nation, the land was divided up into various pockets, various administrative layers that peeled back like an onion. And the manor, in the manorial system, was a small administrative centre. The manor house is right at the heart of it, and it's lived in by the lord of the manor. So it's that small area's feudal overlord, it's his house. What is the difference between a house and a cottage? So I believe that this question has been motivated by the news about what's happening at Frogmore at the moment. Frogmore Cottage, as I'm sure many of you know, is the residence of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. However, we have just seen news that the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have moved into Frogmore House. Now, that doesn't mean they've moved into the home that is the residence of the Sussexes, because they are different buildings. The house at Frogmore is the bigger main house on the plot of land. The cottage is built within the grounds. It's smaller. And when I say smaller, that definitely downplays it, because this house at Frogmore is what most people would view as a large mansion, and the cottage is not far off. So that's the difference in the case of Frogmore. The house is the main building on the land, the cottage is built on the grounds. They're both still massive and hugely luxurious though. How do you think Henry's, and in this they are referring to the person that becomes King Henry VIII, how do you think Henry's feminized, in comparison to his brother Arthur's upbringing, affected his relationships and perceptions of women? This is a really interesting and hard question to answer. Is it the fact that he is brought up principally in the household of his mother alongside his sisters that is a key to understanding the man he becomes? Is it more about the fact that he was born to be the spare and Arthur the heir, that he was never from his earliest years raised to kingship? In fact, it seems that the intention originally was to put him into the church. Perhaps if things had turned out differently, Henry wouldn't have been King Henry VIII, rather he would have been the Archbishop of York, the Prince Archbishop of York, and we may never have seen Thomas Wolsey rise to power. Is it possible that being raised in this feminised setting by his mother, surrounded by his sisters and other women, in some ways spoilt him? Did these ladies indulge him? I mean, we like to believe that's what women do, isn't it? That they indulge and spoil boys. I'm not sure I buy that. What makes Henry think, when he becomes king, that he is entitled to marry for love? I don't believe that his mother or his sisters would have put that notion into his head. They certainly couldn't marry for love. Also, at this point, if they are expecting Henry to join the church, there's going to be no talk of marriage, although perhaps that's why. They didn't talk about what was expected of him in marriage because it wasn't thought that he would marry. But where does he get this notion of believing that he should fall in love with the women he marries? I'm not sure. Because it's not what a medieval or early modern king or nobleman would expect. You marry for diplomacy, you marry to negotiate, and for the procreation of children that can take on your role after you've died. If you want pleasure, if you want romance, then seek out a mistress. But that isn't what Henry does. Henry goes through this idealisation and then discard cycle. And I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist, but I do believe that that is potentially diagnosable as something. He idealises women, seeks them out up and until they disappoint him. He is Sir Loyal Heart until he isn't, and then he seems able to cut off his feelings like a tap and become actively cruel. In Henry's discard cycle, we see that on at least 2 occasions, this process ends with the most extraordinary act of violence. He murders, judicially, 2 of his wives. These were women that he idealised, arguably, beyond all measure. They were the apple of his eye, the paragon of his heart, until they weren't. At which point they become traitors, women who have deliberately sought to fail him and spoil his hopes and dreams. They are whores. I don't know if being raised by and in the company of women is what causes that. I don't know what does. I was asked a few questions about how different languages worked within the court setting, what it means for diplomats, how much harder and more tedious these different languages might have made their jobs, and I was also asked if there were translators. Well, for much of medieval history, the language of the court is going to be French. And of course, that's also the language that's spoken by a large swathe of the continent that are England's neighbours. In a larger part of Europe, official legal language is going to be Latin, which is also the case in England. So at this upper echelon of society, among the monarchs and nobles of much of Europe, they at least probably have a common grasp of Latin. Certainly, we're told that when Catherine of Aragon comes to England, the common language between her and Arthur at that time is Latin. That's how they communicate. When it comes to diplomats, and in later periods, when it comes to early modern courtiers, there is an expectation that you can speak at least more than one language. In many cases, a number of languages. That's very fashionable. To be able to have English as your base language, but to be able to speak Latin, Greek, French, Italian, all of these are fashionable attributes. If you're going to be selected to be a diplomat, there is an expectation that you are going to be a linguist. We know that Anne Boleyn, her time spent in France, is about getting that language skill up. When she comes back to England, it's said that you would have taken her for a Frenchwoman born. And part of the reason why she is able to have that experience and that education is because her father, Thomas, was also a linguist. He is sent to the courts of France, to the court of Margaret of Austria as well, and there he uses his French to make his way in the world, his daughter's way in the world, and also to press the needs of his king. When there are people coming to England, potentially to be the Queen, who can't speak the language, they're coming with an entourage. So they are going to have people who can speak both their native language and also the language of the kingdom into which they are going to become a queen. There might be legal documents for them to sign. They're going to need to understand what's being said to them and what's being written about them and to them. So they're going to have translators in their entourage. But the expectation is that in due course, as rapidly as possible, they will become proficient in the language of their new home. Certainly, if we look at Catherine of Aragon, by the time she marries Henry, she's fluent in English. Why do we say bless you for a sneeze? As with so many things like this, there are a number of ideas about where these sayings, these traditions come from. One particularly famous one is that the bless you thing emerged at the time of the plague or the Black Death. Some say it started in Rome. I think that's because Rome is a religious city, or viewed as being the city of the Roman Catholic faith, obviously, and that when people sneezed, it was thought to be a warning sign that they might have contracted plague. People are saying bless you either to ward off the plague or to bless their soul for the ultimate eventuality of them getting plague and thus dying. The other alternative is that they thought that when you sneezed, your soul jumped out of your body, which in turn left space for the devil to come in and claim your body, or for the devil to steal your soul that had jumped out of your body. So essentially you're blessing the person so that the soul jumps in before the devil can either jump in or take it. Another idea that I've read is that you say bless you to encourage the sneezer's heart to start beating again. There was apparently a thought that when you sneezed, your heart stopped beating. Alternatively, it might be as simple as a polite, old-fashioned version of going, "Oh, you just sneezed," and commenting on the fact that that had just happened. In short, we aren't sure, but those are some of the probably many ideas, a few of which I've no doubt missed out. Where are the ton now? I don't think I'm stretching things to say that the term the ton is back in our collective vocabularies and imagination because, in large part, of the popularity of the Netflix show Bridgerton. However, what that's done is it's also brought back a mythical definition for this phrase, for this identification of group. The ton is believed to refer to the upper 10,000 individuals in British Regency society, which is great. So you've got 10,000 people, king, princess, duke, earl, and once you get to the moment of 10,001, that person then isn't in the ton, but everybody above them is. I can see why that's popular. It makes some sense. However, it's almost certainly a myth, because the real ton is most likely to be a contraction of the French term le bon ton. This is a reference to a fashionable group of people who display impeccable class and manners. It's not about the number of them, it's about who they are and how they present. It's a term that gained popularity in the 19th century that then falls out of favour for reasons. And I'll be honest, I'm not quite sure what replaces this, but I think something does. Whether it's the designation of upper class, maybe upper crust, or perhaps simply toffs. How do we go about reading old-timey letters? Well, paleography is a skill that you can get training in. I did, I believe, a 12-week course on paleography, which improved me from having no knowledge to having some knowledge. The problem is with paleography, it's one of the main skills that I would say, if you don't use it, you lose it. And I have fallen massively out of practice. I've got pretty lazy over the course of what's happened in the last 2 to 3 years. So my paleography has really dropped off. I may in fact need to do a refresher course. And what's made me, I think, even lazier is the fact that many institutions, many archives where you would have to use your paleographic skills have made transcriptions of that famously chicken scratchy script. So there is a version, usually typed up, that you can read. So you perhaps don't feel all of the need to go back and practice your paleography. When it comes to reading these letters, once you have either learnt paleography or you've got a good transcription, you still have to get the sense of them. You still have to look into the etiquette that sits behind the writing of these letters, especially if they may have a diplomatic role. You have to uncover the ways in which somebody might choose to be a little bit sassy, or maybe passive-aggressive, or even heavily romantic, while still holding on to protocol. I think perhaps a modern version of this might be like when a British person says sorry after someone bumps into them, but there's a tone to it, so it's like, sorry. Or perhaps when a lady from one of the southern states says, bless your heart. But we know that in both of those cases, there is a strong subtext that doesn't actually mean either sorry or bless your heart. What is an abbey? What makes an abbey? What is the difference between Westminster Abbey and, say, Downton Abbey? An abbey was a type of monastic building that was constructed to house a particular order of monks and or nuns. These religious people would be headed by an abbot and or an abbess, hence an abbey. Downton Abbey, on the other hand, is a fictional place. It is filmed on location at Highclere Castle, but I do believe that the premise within the TV show is that Downton Abbey, or at least the land that the house we see is now built on, was once ecclesiastical property. Monasticism in England was dealt a substantial blow, unsurprisingly, by the Reformation. During this period, and in its close aftermath, various properties and land that once belonged to the church would be gifted or sold off by the Crown and government. In some cases, these sites would hold on to their original name. They would continue to be known as such and such abbey or such and such priory. The faith practices that had once been performed there were long gone. The name may remain the same, but the usage of the site could, in many cases, not have been more different. What is the difference between the crown jewels and the jewellery of the king, queen, or royal family? The crown jewels are the official jewels of the monarchy, of the crown. They are the ceremonial items that are used in coronation, at the state opening of Parliament, and other ceremonial events. They don't belong to the king or queen or royal family. They belong to the crown. Thus, the king or queen and royal family is part of the monarchy that serves the crown. The king wears the crown, but he does not own it. The crown is looked after by the Royal Collection. This is a separate body that's in charge of making sure it remains intact in one piece. On the other hand, the monarchy, the king, queen, royal family, are fabulously wealthy. They have some incredibly old, incredibly expensive jewellery that they have amassed down the centuries. We are familiar with some of these items. When they go to events and premieres, we see the ladies of the royal family wearing, for example, beautiful tiaras. This tiara, commonly referred to as the Cambridge Lover's Knot, is one of the ones that springs to mind. It was reportedly one of Diana, Princess of Wales's favourite pieces, having been loaned to her as a wedding gift from Queen Elizabeth II. Now, Diana's daughter-in-law, Catherine, Princess of Wales, is the one who has been seen wearing the tiara on a few more recent occasions. If Catherine should come to find this piece uncomfortable at some point, if it needed to be adjusted or remade, or perhaps, say the monarch for some reason decides to donate it or sell it, it is their possession with which they are free to act as they wish. However, the royal family might feel the same way about St Edward's crown, for example, which is the crown of coronation. They are not going to be permitted to sell that or to gift it, whereas they can with their own private jewellery. They can sell it, they can gift it, they can bequeath it in wills in ways that they can't do with the items that form part of the crown jewels. I hope that makes some sense. How did Tudor embalming work? I think it's important that I flag up that I don't completely understand how contemporary embalming functions. I don't know the techniques, what it all entails, but what I am pretty sure of is that if we compare contemporary embalming to Tudor embalming is going to look rudimentary to such a large degree that these are almost not the same practice. Like, it feels wrong to call them both embalming because they are wildly different things, I believe. In the Tudor period, people are embalmed when they occupy rarefied ranks in society. We are talking the upper echelons of the nobility, we are talking members of the royal family, people who, when they die, the expectation is that they will be buried somewhere that befits their status. And if they die far away from that place, they're going to need to be moved, usually across road, maybe by sea, maybe by river, but it's going to take time. Embalming is about buying time for that body to move to a suitable burial spot. Here's how Tudor embalming is said to play out. The body is cut open after being washed. It is then eviscerated. The viscera are set aside. They are placed in a box, maybe in a jar, with herbs and spices. The cavity is then rinsed out with various antiseptics, various disinfectants, and packed then with herbs and perfumes to try and prevent further decomposition. The viscera may travel with the body, or it may be buried somewhere else. Once the body has been washed, eviscerated and packed, it is then sealed up and wrapped in a wax cerecloth. This cerecloth is then itself sealed with various balms, waxes, and then placed inside a lead-lined coffin that's then also sealed. They aren't embalming people so that they can have an open casket funeral, for example. As I said, they are embalmed, wrapped in cerecloth, and then sealed into a lead-lined coffin. The intention is to make something air and water tight, and you need the body to be as stable as possible within that so that it doesn't warp the lead and potentially risk blowing the coffin open. You want to keep them stable so you can transport them. You can get them from where they died to the fitting place of burial for someone of their rank. Embalming is about preserving the body sufficiently, not permanently, but well enough that it can go through that journey as safely, cleanly, and smelllessly as possible. Why did Elizabeth I never meet Mary Queen of Scots? Before I try and answer this one, I just want to say that I am still on the fence about whether this should be something that I attempt to answer here, or whether it needs a more in-depth discussion and should in fact be its own video. I'm not sure. So I'm going to try and answer it here. If you think I haven't given enough detail, enough explanation, if you'd like to know more, let me know in the comments and I can always expand out my answer into a fuller video. Why won't Elizabeth meet Mary? We don't know. Elizabeth never makes it clear. Some have suggested that the Queen of England was concerned that her Scots cousin might outshine her. Mary, her fellow redhead, known to be a great beauty, already with one living son. Is it possible that if these two women were in a room, Mary's majesty might in some way eclipse Elizabeth's. Is this something that she was concerned about? Also, if Elizabeth agreed to meet Mary, would it be seen as a sign, or would it be required to be announced that Elizabeth was recognising Mary as her heir? And with that being said, Elizabeth is resolute. She believes that Mary is the true Queen of Scots. She thinks it's disgraceful that she has been unthroned. She doesn't like this treatment of a regnant queen, understandably. If on the one hand you recognise that Mary is the regnant Queen of Scots, like you, a queen in her own name, in her own right, anointed before God, and thus worthy of the same title, status and respect as you yourself would claim, how are you going to hold her as a prisoner? How are you going to meet that queen as your prisoner? I think it adds to the confusion of the whole thing. Additionally, there are some who point out that Elizabeth was no doubt astute enough to realise that things being as they were, there was a very real possibility that at some point she may have to sign the warrant that permitted Mary Queen of Scots to be executed. Was her reticence to meet, then, about avoiding pain and guilt? By not putting a face to the name, by avoiding the woman, the cousin, that she may one day have to have killed? Was there a connection between Thomas Cromwell and Oliver Cromwell? Yes, Oliver Cromwell was the great-grandson of Richard Williams. Richard's alias was Richard Cromwell. It was by this name that he arguably would come to be better known. Richard Cromwell was the nephew of Thomas Cromwell. Richard's mother was Thomas's sister. The same questioner also asked why the late Queen was known as Queen Elizabeth II when her mother was also a Queen Elizabeth. Shouldn't she more properly have been known as Queen Elizabeth III? And I think in some ways I touched on this topic in a way that might have answered it in last Friday's video, but I didn't answer this question specifically, so I'm going to do so now. The number that comes after a monarch's name is their regnal number. You have to be a regnant monarch to have that number. You can't be a consort. So what that means is, if you take, for example, Mary II and William III, they both have regnal numbers because they were both regnant rulers of this country. However, Queen Elizabeth II, her husband is Prince Philip. He's not Philip I or Philip II or Philip III because he was a consort and she was the regnant. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was a Queen Consort, and so therefore she has no regnal number. Charles III is king. His wife is his Queen Consort. He has the third as his regnal number. She is a consort, so no regnal number. I think I can foresee a follow-up question to this, and it is certainly one that I did answer in the last video, but I will just pop it in here to avoid any confusion. I can imagine that people are going to ask, well, why is it King Charles III and Queen Camilla when Camilla is a Queen Consort, but it was Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh? And simply that is because the expectation is that a king will outrank and supersede a queen, that he will be her superior, so to speak, and that isn't what's going on here. Elizabeth was a queen regnant in her own right by herself, and Philip was her consort. Now, had Philip been king of his own dominion, of his own realm, then it may well be the case that he would be styled as King Philip. So it might have been Queen Elizabeth II and her husband, King Philip, the King Consort, because his proper title would be king. And he may have had a regnal number, but he would be whatever number of Philips there had been in the country of which he was a regnant king. That would have been his regnal number, had he held that title. I do hope that that's cleared that up and I haven't just made it more confusing. And that's where I'm going to bring this Q&A to a close. I do want to restate very clearly, if I didn't answer your question in this video, then it's almost certainly because I have the intention of making a dedicated standalone video on that particular topic at some point in hopefully the very near future. But I am keen to know what you think of today's questions and answers. Were there things that surprised you? Are there things that you would like to see clarified? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video, or you can find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box, so do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please share it with your friends. Please also let me know you liked it by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel. And if you think you're subscribed, this is the perfect time to have a little check. Make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will. While you're there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, you're going to spot a bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button. Please do hit that and then select all in the drop down that will appear so that YouTube will tell you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye bye for now.